In this video, you'll learn how to automate your Jira Cloud backups so they run on schedule, land safely in cloud storage, and alert you when anything goes wrong. Let's get started. First, let's look to see how backups work in Jira Cloud. And this is important because it'll help you understand what you're automating and how to troubleshoot it as you go. So we're going to go to System Settings and scroll down to the Backup Manager under Import and Export. And this displays the Jira Cloud Backup Manager. And this is where you can create your backup for cloud. And there are two steps for generating a backup file, and you can automate both of these steps. The first step is to tell Jira to create the backup file using this button here. And the second step is to download the backup file when it is available. So I'm going to create a backup for cloud. And once your backup file is generated, Jira will give you a link where you can download your backup as a zip file. And this link will stay here for 14 days. So you can come back to the screen anytime you want and download your most recent backup file as long as it is no more than 14 days old. And those are the two steps for generating a backup. First, tell Jira to create the backup file, and then download the backup file and store it somewhere. The other thing to understand here is this include attachments checkbox, which you see I deselected when I created my backup. This is important because it not only specifies the scope of your backup, but it controls how frequently you can create a backup file. So Jira will only allow you to include attachments in a backup once per 48 hours. So if you have this option selected, you can only use this feature to create a new file once every 48 hours. If you have it deselected, you can generate backups as frequently as you want to. And so in your automation strategy, you'll want to include a mix of backups that have attachments and backups that do not, if you want to generate backups more frequently than once every 2 days. So this is the manual process. Now let's look at the automated process. In this video, I'm using AWS to automate my backups. If you're an AWS user, I trust that you already know how to log in and find your way around. And if you're using another platform, I'll leave you to adapt these steps to your preferred technology stack. Okay, let's get started. Okay, so the first step is to create a secret inside AWS Secrets Manager where we can store our API credentials because our automation routine will need to use Jira Cloud's APIs to run. So we'll go into AWS Secrets Manager like you see here, and we'll select Store a New Secret. And we are going to create a secret of the other type of secret, and we will use key value pairs. And I'm going to create one key for my email address, and I will create another one for my API token that the automation will use. To create an API token, we need to jump back over to Jira, and I'm going to go to my account settings, select security, and create and manage API tokens. It's going to ask me to enter a verification code. And now I can create a new API token. I'm going to call this Jira Cloud Backups. You might want to set a longer expiration date and then press create. Then you'll copy this to your clipboard and you will paste it right here. Of course, I'm not putting my real API token in the video recording. Okay, then we will press next. We're going to give this a name. I'm going to call this Atlassian Cloud Backups. This way I can use this not only for Jira Cloud backups, but also for Confluence Cloud, which I'll show in another video. And then leave everything else at its default and press next. Again, leaving the defaults, press next. Here's the summary. And I can store my secret. Refresh my screen, and now I have a secure secret with my API credentials that my automation script can use later on. Okay, the next step is to create a place for us to store our backup files after we download them, and I'll use AWS S3 for this, and I'm going to create a new bucket to store my backup files. This will be a general purpose bucket, and I'll give it a name. Names must be globally unique, so I recommend putting your company name or some other unique identifier before your bucket names. We'll call this Jira Cloud Backups. Going to leave everything at its default, including not having versioning. We don't need versioning. And we will press Create Bucket. This gives us our bucket for storing our zip files that Jira creates for us. And before we finish here, we want to create a retention policy so our bucket doesn't get too full. So we'll create a lifecycle rule and Jira Cloud Backups retention policy. And for this policy, we're going to expire our backup files after 31 days. And because we do not have versioning enabled, this will delete our backup files for us. And the reason why I'm setting this to 31 days is because Atlassian only guarantees that a cloud backup file will work for 30 days. So there's really no reason to keep them longer than that. Of course, if you want to be more risk averse than that, you can design your retention policy however you want to, but I'm going to set this for 31 days so that I have 30 days worth of backup files, which is what Atlassian will support. Press create rule. Oh, and there's an error here. I missed the filter type. I do not need to set a filter. I'm going to apply this policy to all objects in the bucket. Acknowledge that. And now I can create my rule. Okay, so now I have a retention policy on my bucket that I have created for storing our backup files. I am in AWS Lambda, and we will create our first function. I'm going to author from scratch. I'm going to give this a name. I'm going to call this Jira Backups Trigger because this script is the one that triggers the creation of the backup file. And I will use Python for creating the script and leave everything else at its default. This creates an empty Lambda function that's ready to support a Python script. And to save time, I have a pre-written script that is available for me to upload. And in the video description, I will share the Git repository where you can upload this same script for yourself. So I've uploaded my Jira Backups Trigger file. I'm going to save this. And this zip file contains a pre-written script that will use Jira's API to tell Jira to create the backup file. And it contains all of the Python modules necessary for the script to run. So this is a self-contained package that is ready for execution. But there are two things the script needs to know before it can run successfully. It needs to know the name of your Jira site that it's backing up, and it needs to know where to find the AWS secret that stores the API credentials. So we need to tell the script that information, and we will use environment variables for that. So I'll go to add environment variables, and I'm going to create the 3 environment variables listed in the header of the script file. Okay, so I've created my 3 environment variables, a site name that tells the script the name of the Jira site I'm backing up, including the Atlassian.net portion of the name, if that applies to your site. The credential secret name, this is the name of the secret that I created in Secret Manager previously, and the credential secret region name, which for me is US West 2. You'll enter the AWS region that you're using and then press save. Okay, and the last thing we need to do before we test our script is update its permissions from its configured role so that it has access to that secret that we are pointing it to. So we can see that AWS created a new role for our Lambda function when it created it. We're going to open this up in a new tab and grant this role permission to the resources that we created previously. To do this, we're going to go to Add Permission and create an inline policy. Then we'll select our service, which is Secrets Manager. And we want to give the ability to get a secret value. And we want to grant access to the secret that we created. So we're going to go to add ARN, and we will paste the ARN of our secret. Press next. and create our inline policy. We'll give this a name and press create policy. Back in our AWS Lambda function, we can now test this function. Okay, first we have to create a new test event. We can leave the hello world template because we're not actually using any parameters yet. Let's give this a name, press save. And now we can test our Lambda function. It's running. And it was successful. If we jump over to our backup manager in Jira Cloud and refresh the screen, we can see that indeed there is a backup in process that was triggered from our function. Okay, now that our function is working, the last thing we need to do for this Lambda function is add triggers so that it will run on a schedule. We're going to create two triggers. One for a daily backup that does not include attachments, and one for a weekly backup that does include attachments. You design your policy however you want, but you might remember that you can only download attachments once per 48 hours. So to keep my automation simple, I will download attachments once per week, but you can design this however you want. So we're going to create a trigger from EventBridge. We're going to create a new rule, and we are going to call this the Jira Backups Daily Trigger Event. Okay, and this, using a cron expression, this will run at 10 a.m. UTC, which is 6 a.m. in my time zone, every day, Monday through Saturday. We'll add this trigger. And we want to add a second trigger that will run once a week for our full backup. And this will run the same time of day, but only on Sundays. Add this. Okay, so now we have our two triggers. Here they are here. Okay, so we're going to go into our weekly trigger, and we are going to configure the target to pass a parameter into the Lambda function. So we'll go to additional settings. For configure target input, we're going to pass JSON. And we're going to tell the Lambda function to include attachments. The Lambda functions are programmed to exclude attachments by default so that they can run as frequently as possible. But if you want to tell it to include attachments, you just pass this include attachments parameter set to true, and we will press next, next. And now we have configured our weekly trigger to pass that special parameter in that tells it to include attachments. So now we have a completed Lambda function with two triggers. 6 days a week, it's going to run with its default settings, and once a week, it's going to run with that additional parameter that will tell it to include the attachments, thus creating a full backup every Sunday. Now that I have my first Lambda function working, let's create the second one that will, instead of triggering the backup, it'll download the backup once it is ready. And we are going to follow the same process. Jira Backups, we'll call this Jira Backups Download. It's going to use Python, just like the first one. And we're going to leave everything else the same. We're going to upload this from a pre-made zip file, just like the first one. Look at the video description to find where you can download this for yourself. So now I have my code for downloading the backup file. Just like the first script, this is a fully contained Python script with all of its dependent modules prepackaged, so it's ready to run, but it does need some environment variables just like the first one. It needs the same 3 as the first script: the site name, the credential secret name, the credentials region name, and it needs a 4th variable to know where to place the backup files. So that's the S3 bucket name. Let's go to add environment variables, and let's create our environment variables here. Okay, I've created my 4 environment variables: the site name that I want to download the backup from, the secret name and secret region where the script can find my API credentials, and the name of the S3 bucket that I created earlier for storing these backup files. Let's save these. Just like before, we also need to give our function the permissions that it requires. So we're going to open up our pre-created role and create an inline policy, just like we did earlier. We're going to first grant access to our secret manager, secret, get secret value. And we will add the specific ARN from our secret. And we will also add permission to access our S3 bucket. And this will require the ability to write, and that is put object. Okay, and we'll reference our specific S3 bucket and create our policy. Okay, there is one more configuration change that we need to make, and that is under General Configurations, and it says the timeout value. You can see that Lambda functions by default timeout after 3 seconds, which for this particular function where we need to download a zip file from Jira is not going to be enough time in most cases. So we need to increase this timeout value. And to be risk adverse, we will set the maximum timeout for this function, which is 15 minutes. And 15 minutes should be pretty good for downloading a zip file in most cases, especially since this is downloading through AWS and not from our local machines. And we should have made the same change in our first function. So very quickly, I'm going to do a detour and fix that. Here's the first function. Timeout is still at the default value of 3 seconds. And let's set this to 1 minute, which is plenty of time to make a single API call to the Jira API. Save this change. Okay, back in our second function where we are downloading the file, we are now ready to test this. So let's go to our home screen and run a test. Create a new test event. Leave this as the default Hello World test event and save it. And we can now run our test. And it is successful. So let's check our S3 bucket. Here's our S3 bucket that we created earlier, and we can see that we did successfully download the zip file from Jira and upload it into S3. So this function is working just fine. And now the last thing to do is add a trigger from EventBridge so that we can schedule this function to run every single day. EventBridge, and we will create a new rule. Give it a name. And this rule is also configured to run off a cron expression, but the differences are that first, this is going to run every single day. That's because we can use the same function to download and store our backup file, regardless of whether it's the partial backup or full backup. So we don't need to distinguish between days of the week like we did previously. And this is configured to run 1 hour after the first trigger, which creates the backup file. And that's because in my site, 1 hour is plenty of time for Jira to create the backup file. So I know that the backup file will be ready by the time the second trigger runs. In your environment, you might need more time depending on the size of your data, and that's okay. Just experiment with the amount of time it takes Jira to generate backups in your site, and then space these two event triggers accordingly. Now that our automation scripts are configured and scheduled, the last step is to generate email notifications when any of those scripts encounter an error. And to do this in AWS, we're going to go to CloudWatch Alarms, and we'll create an alarm. select the metric, and we're going to go to Lambda, and we're going to find the errors condition from our trigger backup, which runs first, and select this metric, and we will select the maximum statistic, and if it's ever greater than or equal to 1, meaning if we ever have a single error inside a 5-minute period, then we will trigger this alarm, and we want the alarm to be sent to our email address. Okay, so now we will send an email when the alarm activates, and we'll send it to our email address and create this topic and go next. Give it a name, press next, and create our alarm. All right, let's make sure that this is working. So to test our email notifications, let's force an error condition. So what I'm going to do is temporarily update my code with invalid credentials. And deploy this change and test my function again. This should fail with an authentication error. There we go. We have our authentication error, and let's make sure we have an email notification. One side note I forgot to show a minute ago is one thing we need to do before we test our new subscription is come into our email and see if AWS sent us one of these subscription confirmation emails. If it did, make sure you confirm your subscription in your email account before you test your alarm. Okay, a few minutes passed. You won't receive your alarm email right away, of course, but a few minutes after I generated that error, you can see I did get an alarm email in my account, so I know that I have a problem with my backup. Now, this doesn't tell me exactly what went wrong, so I have to go into AWS and view the log files to see why did my Lambda function fail. But if you ever encounter a problem with your backups, you will receive an email. They won't just fail silently behind the scenes. So when you receive one of these emails, you can jump in and investigate and fix the problem. Okay, now that we know that our alarm feature is working correctly, see this first alarm was activated as we just saw, we need to create a second alarm for our other function. So we'll go through the same process again, select metric, go to Lambda. This time we are going to select error conditions from our second function, which is the download function, and we'll configure the rest of this the same way. This time we're going to select an existing topic. We've already created this, so we can use the same subscription topic for both alarms. And go next, give this a name, right, and now we have 2 alarms, one for each function, and we can test this alarm, same as we did the last one, by updating your code temporarily to force an error condition, and of course make sure you revert your code changes when you're done so that the functions work correctly. And that's it. Now you have a fully automated Jira Cloud backup solution. If you found this video helpful and want more information about using Jira Cloud in a highly regulated environment, check out my website at www.agile-innovations.tech, and I have more waiting for you there. See you next time.